Hello and welcome to the Blood Red Morning Bullington for today, for Thursday. My name's Andrew Beasley. I'm joined by Dave Comerford, and we're here to talk about a couple of things relating to Liverpool and Chelsea, both the game, both the sort of future of players at the clubs, I guess. Liverpool are being fairly strongly linked with Mason Mount. He didn't feature in the match the other night. He was an unused substitute on the bench. But now there's also talk that Frank Lampard is going to be the interim manager at Chelsea until the end of the season. And obviously that may affect things slightly because Mount was one of his sort of favourite players. They've worked together at the past, but at Chelsea, obviously, but also at Derby prior to that. So obviously if Lampard does come in, starts making Mount a regular, is that going to affect his future in the summer? Obviously, it's fair to think that it might, but how do you see it playing out, Dave?
I think on the on-field side, not really, because as much as Mount, was an unused sub the other night, you look at it, he has mostly started every game this season when he's been fit. So, in terms of playing time, I don't think that's the issue, and I don't think that's something that's going to necessarily change too much under Lampard. I think it'll be kind of pretty much where it was at under Potter, under Tuchel as well. I think if you are Chelsea, though, it's still an appointment that will make you more confident that you can kind of persuade Mount, because you have, the manager there who can sort of, probably one of the figures he obviously admires most, has the closest relationship with, and is someone who's going to be kind of, even though he is there on an interim basis, he's going to be kind of that ambassador for Chelsea, really, and will try and persuade Mount, and he could be quite useful for the club in that sense too. Obviously, I don't think it's something they would have considered when they appointed him, but it could be kind of a handy advantage, I think, just because, from the sense we get is that the two of them have a really close relationship. I think they probably might have stayed in touch, even sort of aside from their kind of managerial player roles that they've had. So yeah, it will be interesting to see how that kind of does affect things. It's just a question of really whether playing under kind of that Chelsea legend who will kind of push him to stay is kind of something that reactivates kind of the sentimental side, because reading about this whole Mount thing, it's that he does still love Chelsea. We're talking about someone who's come through the academy here, obviously, but it's about kind of feeling appreciated and valued with the salary, I suppose. So yeah, it is something that I think could affect the dynamics, and it's interesting really that an interim manager will have maybe some long-term stake in the future of a player, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess if we sort of make the fair assumption that the recently fired Everton manager is not going to guide Chelsea to the Champions League this season, then he's not going to get the job on a permanent basis. So I guess perhaps Mount might be interested to sort of wait and see who the next permanent appointment is, whether that be Nagelsmann or Enrique or whoever else is being linked.
Well, Todd Bowley is chaotic, isn't he? For all we know, they could win the first leg against Real Madrid by 1 goal, and then Lampard could get a 10-year contract. The way it's been going recently at Chelsea, it's an interesting point, and obviously it will come down to how quickly Chelsea can line someone up. Bringing Lampard in, a decision, incidentally, that I think is very questionable, considering that that if they were out of the Champions League and their season was over, then I think fair enough, but you have an opportunity there with the squad you have. If you can get the kind of a manager in who's of a higher level, then you could maybe do something. Whereas now I think they've really kind of limited themselves. But yeah, what they have done is bought time basically to kind of get that appointment and do what kind of other clubs have failed to do, I suppose, and get that manager in sort of for the kind of when Erik ten Hag came in at Man United last season, I suppose. I think he sort of started work kind of within a week of the season ended. That's ideally what you'd want. And that, obviously will come into Mount's thinking too. But again, I don't think he wants to leave Chelsea for necessarily sporting reasons. I don't think he wants to leave them for kind of any sort of sentimental reasons. I think it is literally a case of the club's stance on kind of a renewal and the amount of money they're being offered, he doesn't feel reflects his true worth, especially when he compares it to colleagues in the squad. So I think really you'd be looking at change higher up to make a difference to the kind of negotiations, while obviously the kind of changes in management, both in the interim sense and obviously the long-term successor will, Matt will be aware of those. They'll factor into his thinking in some way. I don't think it's necessarily going to be a decisive issue within the kind of saga, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, if it is sort of salary concerns that he's got, I mean, you wouldn't think he would come into Liverpool as one of the top earners. No doubt more than he's on now, perhaps. But he's probably not going to go right to the top of the pecking order at Liverpool. So if that is a factor, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Now, if Mount does join Liverpool, or whether he does or not, someone is bound to this summer in midfield. It may affect the future of Curtis Jones. He's the other player we're sort of mainly going to focus on today. He made a rare start at Chelsea the other night. I think it was only his third of the season in all competitions, something like that. He hasn't had much game time at all. He's only had about 300 odd minutes in the league. I thought he did pretty well, all things considered. But, how did you see his performance on Tuesday?
There's a moment in the game where I think he receives a pass from one of the defenders, kind of drives forward and plays the ball into Jota, I think it was. And Jota can't quite get a shot away. Maybe in another world, that's an assist. And the performance, the conception of the performance changes, based on something like that. And that for me is kind of what I kind of envision with Jones. It's kind of those kind of drive and runs forward, that kind of attacking impetus from midfield, that impact that he can make, as well as kind of, I think back to you remember the 2-leg tie against Leipzig behind closed doors.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Jones started both legs, but certainly one of them. And I was struck by kind of how disciplined his performance was. So when I'm thinking about kind of the best version of Jones, I'm thinking about someone who can kind of be an attacking force, but also kind of gives you that defensive contribution as well. I think it was probably a missed opportunity overall. I think it was kind of more of the same with Jones in terms of you kind of left feeling that you want more. I mean, maybe mediocre is too harsh, but it did kind of border on that, certainly. And so there were good moments within the game. I think he faded in the second half. I think obviously there was that moment where he kind of picked up a yellow card for complaining too harshly about the yellow. So his frustration was evident there, and maybe that was a sign of him kind of being a bit annoyed that he had been able to fully grasp his opportunity. I mean, it's hard, to defend him a bit. He's obviously, like you said, Andrew, been dropped in kind of out the cold a little bit, which is inherently difficult. And then you look at the kind of midfield he's up against. I mean, that was a kind of amazing midfield, wasn't it? Of Fernandes, Kovacic, and Kante to be facing, and considering the level of the Liverpool team generally, I mean, I don't think anybody was above a 6 out of 10 against Chelsea. Then these are all mitigating factors. But has Jones done enough to improve his long-term prospects? Has he done enough to, force his way into contention for the game against Arsenal? I don't think so, to be honest.
No, fair enough. I mean, do you think, obviously he signed a long-term contract. I think it was earlier this season, but he's certainly got quite a lot of time left on his contract. But despite that, he hasn't been playing all that much, as we've said. He has had some injuries, but, at the same time, there's also been games where he's been available and hasn't even made the matchday squad of 20 players. I think you could make a case that he's arguably one of Liverpool's more saleable assets at the moment, in that he is on a long contract. He's a young player, a lot of time ahead of him. I suppose it's a two-part question. Do you think they would listen to offers for him? And would you if you were in charge?
I think yes to both. I think that sums it up with Jones for me is if you think back to that goal against Everton, when Liverpool played that really young team and obviously, upset them at Anfield. That was more than 3 years ago now. And how much progress has Jones really made in that time? How many kind of performances has he produced, which have been kind of wow games? I mean, maybe there was that one against Porto in the Champions League. Maybe there's a handful of others, but really you're kind of looking at maybe sort of 5 or fewer, really, that kind of really left you very impressed. So I think with that in mind, Liverpool will kind of be aware that he probably isn't going to reach his potential, and he probably isn't going to be a player who can be a starter for Liverpool long term. And I think when the contract was signed, part of me did wonder, I guess a little bit cynically, is it just a move to kind of protect and increase his transfer value? The thing I think is helpful for Liverpool is, him being English, obviously being homegrown. I think, you get kind of that inflated hype when you're English as well. Young player still, long contract. That should lead itself to a transfer fee that I think a lot of people would consider too high. But how often do we see clubs paying over the odds for kind of English talents? I think you've got to find someone who is, you could either phrase it as willing to take a gamble or someone who's being a bit, reckless with their money, I think, and giving Liverpool a very hefty sum, because it's possible. I think, given the kind of factors that I mentioned, and, like you say there, Andrew, does he deserve, or can we really envisage him figuring kind of within a revamped Liverpool midfield? I don't think so. I mean, the way I say it, the only reason you keep him around is because you're losing 3 midfielders, assuming Milner goes as well. Obviously, that might not happen. And, he's young, I suppose, and he is on that contract. So maybe you just kind of keep him around there for purely depth purposes. But for me, I think about the summer as kind of an opportunity that we have to take, and part of, the success of that is going to come down to how well Liverpool sell as well. Because, if they do buy Bellingham, that could be their, for all we know, that could be their entire budget. And then it could come down to what they can make from sales to give them the rest for other midfielders, maybe a centre-back as well. And if you are going to be making sales, then I think you look at Jones, you look at Kelleher, and 1 or 2 others, and you think those are kind of the standout candidates to raise Liverpool some decent money.
Yeah, definitely. I think you make a good point there about, because they're losing 2 or 3 this summer, I think that probably buys Jones another year. But obviously, I think he would need to have a good season next year to go beyond that. And depending on who they bring in, obviously, it's going to affect his chances of doing that. But as with all these things, we'll have to see what happens in the summer, both for Mount and Jones. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we'll be back tomorrow to talk about the latest Liverpool news.